You've been told that medieval knights were noble, chivalrous heroes, but what if I told you that behind closed doors they drank, gambled, cheated, and killed for personal gain? Today we're uncovering the shocking truth about what knights really did when no one was watching. Are you ready? Before we tell you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Chapter 1: The Brutality Beneath Chivalry. When medieval chroniclers wrote of knights, they often painted them as guardians of the weak, protectors of widows, and champions of the oppressed. The Church promoted this image relentlessly, reminding knights of their sacred duty to defend Christendom. Yet when we turn away from sermons and look at the reality of medieval villages, we see a darker truth. Knights, far from being selfless defenders, were frequently the very men who oppressed the peasants under their charge. The brutality of knights was not an accident. It was built into the very system of feudalism. A knight held his land in exchange for military service to his lord. But that land was worked not by the knight himself but by peasants, serfs bound to the soil. These men and women owed rents, taxes, and labor to their knightly lord. If they failed, the knight had every right, by the customs of his time, to enforce obedience with violence. Accounts from the 12th and 13th centuries describe knights leading raids, not against foreign enemies, but against their own tenants. If peasants could not pay a tithe, knights might seize their livestock. If taxes were late, homes could be burned as punishment. One chronicler wrote bitterly of knights who plundered like wolves among the sheep, not caring for Christ's flock but tearing it apart. To understand the reality, imagine a small village on the edge of a knight's estate. The peasants spend months tending the fields, growing barley and wheat, raising a few pigs and chickens. When harvest comes, they owe a portion to the knight, sometimes as much as half. If a poor harvest strikes, the peasants' children go hungry, but the knight still demands his share. His armored men-at-arms ride into the village, spears gleaming, to collect what is due. If nothing is offered, they take what they want by force. The protector of the weak becomes their predator. And yet, to outsiders, this same knight might appear as a noble figure. He would attend Mass, bow before the altar, and kneel in prayer before riding into battle. He would host feasts where troubadours sang of valor and honor. But behind that mask, he was feared by the very people whose protection he claimed as his duty. There are even darker stories. Knights sometimes treated villages as training grounds for their cruelty. Accounts survive of knights practicing swordsmanship on unarmed peasants, forcing them into mock duels, or using captives as live targets for archery. Though these tales were whispered more than written, they speak to a grim reality. Chivalry did little to protect the poor. One striking example comes from the so-called Peace and Truce of God movement. Beginning in the 10th century, the Church tried to control knightly violence by forbidding attacks on peasants, clerics, and the defenseless. Bishops gathered knights and made them swear oaths to respect the weak. But the very existence of such movements tells us how common abuse had become. If knights had naturally lived by the chivalric ideal, there would have been no need for the Church to intervene. The fact that bishops had to threaten excommunication to keep knights from raiding farms shows us how deeply ingrained this brutality was. Of course, knights justified their behavior. They claimed that peasants owed them loyalty and taxes in exchange for protection. But protection often meant very little. A peasant might be spared from foreign invaders, only to be starved, beaten, or humiliated by his own lord. In times of war, knights would strip villages bare to feed their armies. In times of peace, they demanded dues that left peasants perpetually on the edge of famine. When no chronicler was present, when no minstrel was singing songs of glory, the knight's sword was not always raised against invaders or enemies of Christ. More often, it was used to enforce obedience, to crush resistance, and to remind peasants of their place. This was the first and perhaps most shocking secret of medieval knighthood. The oath to protect was as fragile as parchment, easily ignored when greed or power called. The reality beneath the chivalric mask was a world where ordinary men and women lived in fear not of distant enemies, but of the very knights who claimed to defend them. Chapter 2: Lust and Desire, the Secret Affairs of Knights. If chivalry taught that knights should honor women, protect their purity, and uphold Christian morality, the private lives of knights often told a different story. Behind the shining armor and courtly manners, many knights lived with secret desires, forbidden affairs, and scandalous relationships that no priest would dare bless. Medieval society celebrated the idea of courtly love, a romantic tradition where knights professed loyalty and devotion to noble ladies, often in poetry and song. Troubadours in southern France composed verses of knights who pledged their hearts to unattainable women, usually the wives of lords. These poems painted love as spiritual, pure, and almost sacred. But reality was far less poetic. What happened in the dark chambers of castles and in the shadows of villages was not always about noble devotion, but about lust, power, and secrecy. Knights lived in a world where opportunity for temptation was everywhere. They spent much of their time away from home, either at war or in service to a lord. In such settings, they often found companionship among women of the household, servants, handmaidens, even noble ladies whose husbands were absent. Affairs developed in secrecy, sometimes willingly, sometimes under coercion, but almost always hidden from public view. The danger of these liaisons was enormous. A knight caught in an affair with a noble woman could be ruined, stripped of his lands, or even executed. For the woman, the punishment was often worse: public humiliation, imprisonment, or death. Yet this risk only seemed to fuel the secrecy of such affairs. Letters from the 12th and 13th centuries, written in coded language, reveal that knights often used intermediaries to arrange secret meetings. Some even disguised themselves to slip into chambers at night. But not all affairs were with noble women. Many knights indulged in relations with peasant women, women who had little power to resist. The chronicles are full of complaints from bishops and abbots about knights taking liberties with village women, sometimes by force, sometimes by exploiting their position of power. To the peasants, knights were figures of fear, not romantic heroes. A knight might protect a village from bandits during the day, and at night abuse the very people he claimed to safeguard. Even the church struggled with this reality. Priests reminded knights of their vows of chastity before battle and urged them to live as soldiers of Christ. Yet confessions reveal that knights frequently admitted to adultery, fornication, and even visiting prostitutes. In cities and towns, brothels often operated with tacit approval, and knights, with their wealth and mobility, were among the most frequent clients. One fascinating contradiction lies in the cult of the Virgin Mary. Knights publicly praised Mary as the ideal of purity, offering prayers before justs and battles. But privately, many pursued women in ways that directly contradicted the ideal they worshipped. This duality, public devotion, private indulgence, was at the heart of the knightly experience. The danger of secret affairs sometimes spilled into the open. Stories survive of lords discovering their wives' infidelities with knights, leading to violent revenge. In one case recorded in 13th century chronicles, a lord executed a knight by throwing him from the walls of a castle after catching him in his wife's chamber. In another, a jealous husband hired assassins to kill a knight who had seduced his daughter. These tales circulated as warnings, but they also reveal how common such affairs must have been. Knights themselves often bragged about their conquests. In tournaments they sometimes displayed tokens, handkerchiefs, ribbons, or jewels, given by their lovers. While some of these were genuine gifts, others were taken without permission, symbols of desire claimed rather than granted. Troubadour poetry, when stripped of its flowery language, often reflected these realities. The knight as lover was not always the gentle suitor, but sometimes the predator cloaked in the guise of romance. And yet it would be wrong to say that all knightly love was false or exploitative. There were cases where knights and ladies shared genuine affection, where letters of love survived for decades, carefully hidden. Some knights even risked everything: lands, titles, reputations, for the sake of forbidden love. The tragedy of such relationships was that they could rarely be acknowledged openly. So what did knights really do when no one was looking? Many sought the thrill of forbidden passion. They spoke of honor and purity by day, but by night their actions betrayed a hunger that neither sermons nor songs could suppress. Affairs, scandals, and secret liaisons were as much a part of nightly life as tournaments and battles. The shining code of chivalry was not designed to describe reality, it was designed to control it, to keep knights striving for an ideal they rarely achieved. In truth, the desires of the flesh were stronger than the vows of the sword. Chapter 3: The Dice in the Cup, Gambling, Drinking, and Reckless Knights. If knights were expected to embody restraint, self-control, and Christian virtue, their private lives often told a far different story. Beyond the battlefield and the tournament lists, many knights indulged in habits that the church condemned but which their restless spirits demanded: drinking, gambling, and nights of reckless revelry. The Middle Ages was a world of risk and uncertainty. Death came swiftly from war, famine, or disease. For knights, whose profession already demanded that they gamble with their lives on the battlefield, it was natural to extend that appetite for danger into other aspects of life. And so, when no one was looking, knights gathered in castle halls, taverns, and even monasteries to throw dice, wager fortunes, and drink until their senses dulled. Gambling was one of the most common vices of the medieval knight. Dice, cards, later in the period, and wagering on tournaments or horse races consumed countless hours of their lives. Records survive of knights losing not only their money, but their armor, horses, and even land through reckless betting. The church frequently condemned these habits. Councils passed decrees forbidding knights from gambling, reminding them that their duty was to defend Christendom, not to squander their fortunes on games of chance. Yet the very repetition of these decrees reveals how ineffective they were. Wherever knights gathered, dice soon followed. Some chroniclers wrote of entire garrisons spending their wages on games in a single night. Others told of knights who, after losing everything, pawned their weapons or borrowed from moneylenders just to keep playing. The thrill of the game was irresistible, much like the thrill of combat. Winning was not only about wealth but about pride, about proving one's luck or cunning in front of one's peers. In some cases, gambling turned violent. When fortunes were lost and tempers flared, swords were drawn. Feuds erupted between knights who accused each other of cheating, and bloodshed was not uncommon. Ironically, knights who were supposed to uphold the peace were often the ones disturbing it most recklessly behind closed doors. Drinking was another nightly indulgence. Wine, ale, and mead flowed freely in noble halls, and knights were rarely seen without a goblet in hand. To drink was a mark of fellowship, a sign of camaraderie after the dangers of war. But the line between celebration and excess was thin, and knights often crossed it. Contemporary moralists complained about knights who spent their nights in drunken feasts, unable to rise for mass in the morning. Some tales even describe knights so intoxicated that they fell into brawls with each other, smashing tables and shattering goblets, while servants tried desperately to separate them. The dangers of alcohol were not only moral but practical. A knight who could barely stand from drink might still be expected to fight at dawn. Chroniclers noted more than one battle lost because the knights had been drinking heavily the night before. Even kings complained about their knights' drunkenness. King Edward II of England once scolded his household knights for neglecting their duties after nights of drinking and revelry. Knights also mingled with common soldiers and townsfolk in taverns. These establishments were often noisy, smoky, and filled with laughter, but they were also places of danger. Taverns were hotspots for gambling, prostitution, and brawling. Knights, with their wealth and arrogance, often clashed with locals, and many tavern fights ended in blood. Legal records show that knights were not above the law when it came to tavern violence, at least in theory. Some were fined, others imprisoned, but more often their status protected them from serious punishment. A peasant who fought with a knight could face execution, but a knight who killed a peasant in a drunken rage might escape with little more than a fine. The church waged a constant war against these habits. Preachers condemned gambling and drunkenness as sins that led to damnation. Confession manuals from the period frequently listed the throwing of dice and excessive drinking as common sins for knights to admit. Some crusading orders, like the Templars and Hospitallers, forbade their members from drinking heavily or gambling altogether. But for secular knights, the temptations were too strong. The very nature of their lives, restless, violent, and uncertain, pushed them toward vice. War might last only weeks, leaving long months of boredom in castles. In that boredom, dice and drink offered excitement. Publicly, knights spoke of honor, loyalty, and Christian duty. Privately, they lived for the rush of the dice cup, the warmth of wine, and the thrill of reckless nights. They justified their indulgence as harmless entertainment, but in truth it often drained their wealth, fueled feuds, and stained their reputations. When no one was looking, the knight's hand was not always on the sword, it was on the dice, the goblet, or the shoulder of a drinking companion. And in those moments, the noble image of chivalry faded, revealing a man as flawed, reckless, and human as any other. Chapter 4: Faith as a Mask, Religion and Hypocrisy. Few things are more closely tied to the image of the medieval knight than religion. Knights were supposed to be the defenders of Christendom, the sword arm of the Church, and the protectors of pilgrims and holy places. Their very identity was built upon the idea that they fought not only for their lords, but also for God. Songs, chronicles, and sermons portrayed them as holy warriors, kneeling in chapels before battle, lifting their swords as though they were relics. But once again the distance between image and reality was vast. For many knights, faith was less a guiding principle than a mask, a tool for power, a shield for reputation, and a convenient excuse for violence. When no one was looking or when they believed their actions would never be judged, knights often lived in ways that directly contradicted the piety they displayed in public. Publicly, knights were expected to show devotion. They attended mass, sponsored chapels, and marched beneath banners bearing crosses. A knight who ignored religion risked losing the respect of his peers and the favor of his lord. Many knights even hired priests to travel with them, ensuring that their acts of devotion were always visible. On the battlefield, priests would bless the army, sprinkling holy water over the knights before they charged. Chroniclers described scenes of knights praying before relics, swearing oaths on sacred texts, and dedicating victories to saints. These rituals reinforced the idea that knights fought not for personal gain but for a divine cause. Yet behind the curtain of public devotion, many knights lived with shocking disregard for the very faith they professed. Chronicles and court records reveal knights who extorted money from monasteries, robbed churches, and even assaulted clergymen. In times of war, religious buildings were often looted by the very knights sworn to protect them. Gold chalices, reliquaries, and altar cloths were stripped away and sold for profit. One 12th century abbot bitterly complained that knights call themselves soldiers of Christ, yet they strip Christ's altars bare. His words remind us that religion, to many knights, was not sacred but practical, something to be displayed when convenient, and ignored when it stood in the way of ambition. The Crusades highlight this contradiction most clearly. Preachers promised knights that by taking the cross they would cleanse their sins and earn eternal salvation. Thousands answered the call, and crusading became one of the greatest expressions of knightly piety. But eyewitness accounts tell us that crusading knights often plundered as eagerly as they prayed. In Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, knights looted churches, desecrated holy relics, and even melted down icons for wealth. In the Holy Land, crusaders were known to sack towns mercilessly, slaughtering civilians in the name of God. For many, the crusade was as much about wealth and land as it was about faith. One chronicler admitted this openly: "They take up the cross for Christ, but in truth they march for silver and gold." The Church tried to rein in these contradictions through confession. Knights were told to confess their sins before battle and to receive absolution so that, if they died, their souls would be saved. But confession became, for some, a way to excuse their behavior. A knight could commit violence, adultery, or theft, then confess and believe himself cleansed. This cycle of sin and absolution created a culture of hypocrisy. Priests lamented that knights confessed with their lips but did not repent with their hearts. Yet the system allowed knights to live freely, knowing they could always return to the church for forgiveness. Beyond personal hypocrisy, religion was also a tool of power. Knights and lords used piety to justify their actions and strengthen their reputations. A knight who sponsored a chapel or donated land to a monastery could gain prestige and political influence. Public displays of faith, such as endowing a monastery or going on pilgrimage, elevated a knight's status. But many of these donations were motivated less by true devotion than by fear of damnation, or worse, fear of public dishonor. A knight who had lived violently might, near the end of his life, give away vast sums to the church in hopes of buying salvation. This late-life piety did not erase years of brutality, but it ensured that his memory would be celebrated in monastic chronicles as that of a noble Christian warrior. Knights were not completely faithless. Many truly believed in God, feared hell, and sought divine favor. But their faith was often shaped by convenience. They prayed for victory before a battle but ignored Christ's teachings of mercy afterward. They swore loyalty to the church but looted monasteries when money was short. They dedicated themselves to the Virgin Mary but pursued desires that contradicted her purity. This was the paradox of medieval knighthood. Faith was both real and superficial, both deeply felt and casually broken. Knights lived in a world where religion was impossible to escape, but also impossible to obey fully. Their faith was a mask, sometimes sincere, sometimes false, but always worn when the world was watching. When no one was looking, knights did not always pray. They cursed, they cheated, they drank, they seduced, they extorted. They swore vows in the chapel and broke them in the tavern. Religion gave them legitimacy, but behind the scenes many treated it as little more than a costume, an essential part of the performance of chivalry, but not always a reflection of their true lives. And so the knight's cross, painted brightly on his shield, did not always signify holiness. Sometimes it was little more than paint, bold and beautiful on the outside, hollow within. Chapter 5, Politics and Shadows. Knights and Secret Power Games. While the image of the medieval knight often evokes solitary warriors on the battlefield, the truth is that politics and intrigue were as central to their lives as swordsmanship. Knights were not only fighters, they were ambitious men navigating a complex web of loyalties, alliances, and rivalries. And much of this political maneuvering took place away from the public eye, in shadows where few chroniclers dared to follow. Knights owed allegiance to lords, who in turn owed service to kings. These layered obligations created opportunities for both loyalty and treachery. A knight could gain land, wealth, and status by skillfully navigating his relationships with multiple lords, but a single misstep could ruin him. The stakes were high, and many knights learned early that power often required deception. Secret alliances were common. A knight might publicly swear loyalty to one lord while plotting with another to secure land or influence. Such double dealings could involve espionage, bribery, and even orchestrated assassinations. Legal records from the 12th and 13th centuries describe knights accused of secretly undermining their own lords to gain favor elsewhere, showing that political manipulation was an accepted, if dangerous, practice. Knights were often key players in the courts of kings and dukes. By cultivating personal relationships with rulers, they could secure positions, lands, and privileges. Yet this influence was rarely exercised openly. Knights used intermediaries, letters, and clandestine meetings to advance their agendas. Some even employed spies to gather information about rivals, turning intelligence into a weapon as sharp as any sword. In England, for example, knights involved in court politics frequently maneuvered for positions of power that allowed them to control local justice, taxes, or military appointments. Their influence often extended to royal councils, where they could sway decisions in ways invisible to the general populace. Knights also engaged in secret bargaining among themselves. Wagers were not limited to dice and tournaments. They also involved land, military support, and marriages. A knight might promise aid in battle in exchange for a future claim to a fief, or negotiate marriages between families to consolidate power. These deals were often invisible to outsiders, leaving no record except for whispered rumors or disputes that eventually erupted into open conflict. Sometimes these bargains led to betrayal. Knights who broke agreements could be blackmailed, shunned, or hunted by former allies. Loyalty was transactional and trust was always provisional. To the ordinary person, a knight's oath seemed sacred. But to the knights themselves, it was often a strategic tool, a currency to be spent wisely or saved for a decisive moment. Religion, as discussed in previous chapters, was not just a personal matter but a political tool. Knights could leverage piety to their advantage, gaining the church's favor to legitimize their claims or intimidate rivals. Sponsoring a monastery or funding a cathedral could elevate a knight's status far beyond his martial abilities. Conversely, knights who fell out of favor with the church risked excommunication, a severe political weapon that could strip them of allies and lands. Some knights also used clerics as intermediaries in secret deals. Priests and abbots often acted as go-betweens, conveying messages, delivering payments, or vouching for oaths. These arrangements allowed knights to maneuver behind the scenes while maintaining an appearance of public decorum. Not all political maneuvering was subtle. Open feuds were common, and knights often took personal vendettas as seriously as wars declared by kings. Disputes over land, inheritance, or perceived slights could escalate into years-long cycles of violence. Knights might raid each other's estates, ambush rivals, or challenge them to duels, sometimes disguised as tournaments, other times executed in secret. Such conflicts blurred the line between personal ambition and public duty. While a knight might claim he fought for his lord or for justice, the underlying motives were often deeply personal. Wealth, status, and revenge drove many conflicts that chroniclers later recorded as noble battles. In castles and fortresses, the shadow court operated continuously. Knights held private councils, made secret agreements, and plotted the rise and fall of their peers. Decisions about alliances, marriages, and military support were often negotiated in hushed tones behind closed doors. Ordinary people, peasants, townsfolk, and even lesser soldiers, had little knowledge of these maneuvers, and when they did, it was often too late to influence outcomes. The shadow court illustrates a critical truth about medieval knighthood. Power was exercised in secret as much as in public. The knightly image of honor and loyalty masked a world where cunning, manipulation, and strategic thinking were just as important as skill with a sword. Knights, when no one was looking, were not only indulgent in pleasure and vice, but also deeply engaged in political games that could shift the balance of power across regions. They wielded influence, brokered alliances, and manipulated both secular and religious institutions. Their public image as loyal servants of kings and God concealed a complex reality where ambition, secrecy, and strategy defined their lives. The image of chivalry was thus incomplete. The knightly code existed not only as a guide for behavior but also as a veil for ambition. Beneath the polished armor, behind the banners of honor, lay a world of political maneuvering, calculated risks, and secret power games, a world where the strongest sword was sometimes the one concealed in shadow rather than on the battlefield. Chapter 6: The Tournaments and Their Dark Side. Blood, Glory, and Hidden Rivalries. Tournaments are often remembered today as spectacles of bravery, pageantry, and skill. In films and textbooks, knights ride in gleaming armor, joust with courage, and entertain noble audiences with displays of martial prowess. The image is one of noble competition, a harmless outlet for the warrior's energy. But in reality, tournaments were far more complex, and far darker. than the popular imagination suggests. At their core, tournaments were opportunities for knights to train, demonstrate skill, and earn prestige. They tested horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the ability to withstand fear and pain. Knights could gain honor, recognition from peers, and sometimes monetary rewards. Successful tournament participation could elevate a young knight's status, open doors at court, or secure alliances. Yet tournaments were also arenas for ambition. Behind the cheers and music, rivalries simmered, and alliances shifted with every lance and sword. A single mistake could cost a knight both honor and life, while victory could enhance his reputation far beyond the battlefield. Unlike organized battles with clear objectives, tournaments blurred competition with personal vendettas. Knights often used tournaments as pretexts to challenge those they disliked or feared. Injuries and deaths were far from uncommon. Chroniclers recorded countless instances of knights breaking limbs, suffering concussions, or even dying in tournament arenas. Unlike modern sports, protective gear was limited, and the combination of high speed, heavy armor, and lances made every joust dangerous. Despite this, the pursuit of glory drove knights to risk everything. Wealthy spectators and rival knights sometimes encouraged reckless behavior. Bets were placed not only on who would win but on the severity of injuries. Gambling intertwined with the spectacle, and the thirst for money could push participants beyond safe limits. A knight might take extreme risks to impress a patron or secure a financial reward, transforming a sporting event into a contest of survival. Tournaments also served as a venue for settling private grudges. Knights might use the joust to humiliate rivals, challenge enemies, or prove dominance in front of peers. Victories were public, but the motives were often private, intertwined with personal honor, jealousy, or revenge. Observers rarely understood the full context of these contests, seeing only a display of martial skill rather than the intricate web of rivalries motivating each strike. In some cases, knights manipulated tournaments to gain leverage in political or territorial disputes. A skilled or favored knight might intentionally humiliate an opponent to weaken his social standing or provoke him into rash decisions. Tournaments, in this sense, were not merely athletic contests. They were subtle, dangerous tools of social and political influence. As in private life, gambling was a major element of tournament culture. Nobles, knights, and spectators often placed heavy wagers on outcomes. Money, lands, and even marriage contracts could hinge on the results of a single match. The pressure to win, or cheat, was enormous. Some knights colluded with others, fixing bouts or conspiring to humiliate rivals. Cheating was risky but could yield tremendous rewards, and the temptation to manipulate results was always present. The combination of competition, ambition, and greed sometimes led to violence outside the arena. Tournaments could spark feuds, duels, and outright attacks. Injured or humiliated knights might retaliate in secret, extending personal conflicts into prolonged cycles of revenge. While tournaments were public spectacles, their consequences were often private, and sometimes deadly. Spectators enjoyed tournaments for excitement, but the events could also be exploitative. Young squires and poor knights were sometimes pressured into participation, risking life and limb for the amusement of wealthier patrons. Some tournaments were little more than displays of status, with skill secondary to social hierarchy. The highest-ranking knights often dictated the terms of competition, while lower-ranked participants bore the greatest physical risks. Behind the banners, music, and cheers, tournaments revealed a society that celebrated skill and bravery, but also tolerated risk, greed, and exploitation. The public image of noble sport concealed a complex interplay of danger, ambition, and hidden rivalries. In many ways, tournaments encapsulated the duality of knighthood. They showcased courage, skill, and discipline, yet they also highlighted ambition, deceit, and recklessness. Just as knights displayed public piety while indulging in private vices, so too did tournaments display public honor while masking personal rivalries and secret agendas. Knights, when no one was looking, were not merely competitors. They were strategists, gamblers, and risk-takers. Each land strike could carry personal, political, and financial stakes far beyond the immediate contest. And while the spectators cheered for entertainment, the real dramas, the secret plots, the debts, the grudges, played out quietly behind the scenes. Tournaments, in essence, were miniature worlds of the knightly duel life, dazzling in appearance, yet ruthless and calculating beneath the surface. The blood, the glory, and the hidden rivalries of these contests remind us that the story of knighthood is never as simple as legends would have us believe. Chapter 7: Secret Training in the Art of Killing. Beyond the Battlefield. When most people think of a medieval knight, they imagine tournaments, jousts, and grand battles. They picture knights clad in shining armor, galloping heroically across open fields, defending the weak and fighting for honor. Yet beneath this public image lay a hidden, relentless world of training, one that emphasized not chivalry or courtesy but efficiency, cruelty, and the mastery of death. From a young age, boys destined to become knights were introduced to a strict, often brutal regimen. Sons of nobility were sent to live with other knights as pages, learning horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the rigid codes of conduct that would guide their behavior in public. While this training included lessons on etiquette, prayer, and loyalty, much of the daily routine focused on martial skill. Pages practiced with wooden swords, learned to handle real weapons under supervision, and were drilled in endurance exercises that tested their physical and mental limits. This early conditioning was designed to create not only skilled warriors but also psychologically resilient killers. Pain, fear, and exhaustion were used deliberately to simulate the pressures of real combat. A young page who could withstand harsh discipline without breaking was considered ready to become a squire, and eventually a knight. At around the age of 14, a page became a squire, taking on the role of personal assistant to a fully fledged knight. This stage was critical in the hidden education of a knight. Squires learned battlefield tactics, weapon maintenance, and mounted combat. But beyond the formal lessons, they were also exposed to the darker realities of violence. Squires observed the way their knights treated enemies, handled prisoners, and executed punishments. They watched ambushes, raids, and duels, not as distant stories but as practical examples. The lessons were clear. Efficiency in killing, the psychological manipulation of fear, and the tactical use of brutality were as important as sword technique. Knights did not rely solely on the battlefield for their education. Secret drills, private sparring, and clandestine lessons in assassination techniques were all part of the curriculum. Some orders of knights, particularly those involved in border conflicts or political intrigue, specialized in ambushes, sabotage, and the use of stealth. Knowledge of poisons, trap setting, and battlefield deception was passed down quietly, often orally, to ensure that their enemies, and even the church, remained unaware. This hidden training was essential because the ideal of chivalry often conflicted with the realities of war. A knight who strictly followed the public code of honor could be at a disadvantage against ruthless opponents. Survival required a dual identity, the knight in public and the killer in private. A less visible but equally important aspect of training involved the mind. Knights were conditioned to see the act of killing as necessary, even virtuous, when performed in the service of a lord or cause. Desensitization to blood and suffering was a deliberate part of their upbringing. They were encouraged to control fear, suppress empathy for enemies, and focus on efficiency in combat. Psychologists today might recognize this as early exposure to trauma combined with reward structures. A squire who performed well under stress was praised, gaining prestige and advancing faster, while those who faltered risked humiliation or punishment. By the time a knight reached adulthood, he had been conditioned to operate under extreme conditions with a detached focus on lethal effectiveness. Peer pressure played a significant role. Young squires and knights trained together, often pushing one another to greater levels of aggression and endurance. Competition was constant, and failing to meet expectations could result in ridicule or exclusion. This social dynamic reinforced the duality of knighthood, maintaining appearances in public while mastering ruthless efficiency in private. Knights also trained for scenarios beyond traditional battle. Raiding, ambush, and castle assault required skills in improvisation, deception, and intimidation. They learned to exploit fear, using psychological tactics to weaken enemies before physical engagement. This training extended to how knights treated prisoners, handled hostages, and used threats of violence to achieve objectives without expending unnecessary effort. The combination of physical conditioning, psychological desensitization, and clandestine training ensured that knights were not merely soldiers, they were instruments of controlled violence. Publicly, they upheld the ideals of chivalry. Privately, they honed a lethal skill set designed to maximize survival, domination, and reward. When no one was looking, the knight's true education revealed itself. The tournaments, courtly rituals, and oaths were only one side of the coin. Behind closed doors in training yards and shadowed halls, the art of killing was perfected. This secret education, passed down from one generation to the next, created a class of warriors whose efficiency in violence was unmatched, and whose actions often contradicted the noble ideals they professed. Chapter 8: Wealth and Exploitation. How Knights Made Money in Secret. The image of a medieval knight is often tied to nobility, honor, and service, but behind the gleaming armor lay a very practical concern: money. Knights required wealth to maintain their horses, armor, weapons, and households. While some income came legitimately from land, spoils of war, or service to a lord, a surprising amount of a knight's wealth was generated through secretive, often exploitative means. Most knights held estates worked by peasants who owed them labor, rent, or produce. In theory, the knight provided protection in exchange for this service. In reality, many knights manipulated the system to maximize profit. Peasants were compelled to pay additional fees, provide labor beyond legal obligations, and endure arbitrary fines. Knights frequently exploited legal loopholes, enforcing obscure local laws to justify demands for extra payments. Chroniclers of the time describe peasants' resentment of knights, noting that taxation often left villages struggling to survive. Yet for the knight, enforcement of these dues was a necessary strategy to maintain wealth and status. In effect, their supposed role as protectors often overlapped with their role as oppressors. Beyond taxation, knights often increased their wealth through raids. During periods of war, or even during supposed times of peace, knights would seize livestock, crops, and valuables from neighboring territories. These raids were sometimes officially sanctioned, but more often they were opportunistic acts conducted under the cover of authority or silence. A knight could justify plundering by claiming military necessity, a rival's disrespect, or even divine will. Records from border regions in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire indicate that such raids were common. Local populations lived in fear of sudden attacks, and knights gained reputations for both martial skill and ruthless opportunism. The spoils of such actions, gold, livestock, or even hostages for ransom, often constituted a substantial portion of a knight's income. Ransom was another lucrative source of secret wealth. Capturing an opponent in battle or a rival knight during a duel could result in enormous financial gain. Nobles and knights alike would pay significant sums for the return of their kin or comrades. This practice created a complex economy of violence. Knights who excelled at capturing enemies could become unexpectedly wealthy, while those unable to pay ransom risked imprisonment or even death. What is less often acknowledged is that ransom could also be manipulated. Knights sometimes exaggerated the value of captives, threatened prolonged imprisonment, or employed intermediaries to ensure maximum profit. In this way, warfare itself became a vehicle for personal enrichment rather than purely political or territorial objectives. While knights were expected to uphold Christian values, many exploited the church for profit. Monasteries and convents often possessed significant wealth, lands, precious metals, and goods. Knights could extract money through coercion, threats, or protection fees, claiming to safeguard the property from enemies while secretly diverting a portion to themselves. Some knights even leveraged ecclesiastical positions. By forming alliances with bishops or abbots, they gained access to church lands and resources. In certain regions, it was not unusual for knights to receive payments or land grants as compensation for military service, only to impose additional charges or claim privileges that were not publicly documented. Control over trade routes offered another opportunity for secret income. Knights stationed along rivers, roads, or mountain passes could charge tolls and duties, sometimes inflating rates arbitrarily. Merchants often had little choice but to pay, and resistance could lead to violent repercussions. In this sense, knights functioned as both enforcers and profiteers, blending their official duties with private gain. Beyond tolls, knights occasionally engaged in smuggling or illicit trade. They transported goods for profit, bypassing legal restrictions or customs duties. While risky, these activities could yield high rewards and added to a knight's clandestine wealth. As discussed in earlier chapters, gambling was a common vice. Yet it also represented a secret source of wealth for knights willing to take risks. Successful wagers at tournaments, games of dice, or backroom bets could bring substantial gains. Conversely, failed bets could ruin a knight financially, illustrating the precarious balance between risk and reward in medieval society. All of these activities, taxation, raids, ransom, church exploitation, trade manipulation, and gambling, demonstrate a central truth. Wealth for knights was not merely a sign of status but a tool for influence. Money allowed knights to equip themselves better, secure alliances, and assert authority over both peers and subordinates. The accumulation of wealth, often through secretive or morally ambiguous means, was therefore integral to the survival and advancement of a knight. While chronicles often glorify knights for valor in battle, the economic dimension of knighthood reveals a different reality. Many knights were adept at turning opportunity into profit, sometimes at the expense of the very people they were sworn to protect. Publicly they appeared noble and pious. Privately they were shrewd, opportunistic, and in some cases ruthless in their pursuit of wealth. The duality of knightly life, honor in public, exploitation in private, is a recurring theme in medieval history. Knights, when no one was watching, were not just warriors, they were businessmen, tax collectors, and profiteers. Their armor and swords were tools of power, but so too were their cunning, ambition, and willingness to bend moral rules. Chapter 9: The Shadows of War, Violence Beyond the Battlefield. When we imagine medieval knights, we often focus on grand battles, sieges, and heroic charges. Yet the reality of warfare in the Middle Ages extended far beyond these public spectacles. The true nature of knightly violence often played out in the shadows, behind castle walls, along village roads, and in the hinterlands of conflict zones. These acts, largely invisible to chroniclers' pens or painted banners, reveal the darker side of knightly power and ambition. While knights were theoretically protectors of the weak, they frequently engaged in raiding neighboring villages, whether during wartime or under the guise of authority. Chroniclers record that peasants were often subjected to looting, extortion, and even massacre at the hands of knights, supposedly their guardians. Livestock was seized, grain stores emptied, and homes burned as demonstrations of power or to supplement the knight's income. This practice was not limited to enemy territory. In times of peace, disputes over land, taxes, or personal grievances could lead knights to raid territories belonging to their neighbors or even their own tenants. These raids blurred the line between lawful enforcement, revenge, and outright criminality. To the peasants there was little difference. The consequences were the same: fear, starvation, and violence. Warfare itself was a lucrative enterprise. Knights often profited from pillaging, taking valuables from conquered lands or defeated enemies. Monasteries, towns, and even smaller castles could be stripped of gold, silver, and other valuables. These spoils were not always recorded or reported, meaning that the public image of knights fighting for their lord or country often obscured personal enrichment gained through brutality. Looting was sometimes systematic. Knights and their men-at-arms would plan assaults to maximize gain, coordinating with allies to seize the most profitable targets. Chroniclers occasionally noted the moral implications, yet enforcement was weak and greed often outweighed ethics. Captives were a significant aspect of knightly strategy. While high-ranking prisoners could be ransomed for substantial sums, lower-status captives often suffered harsher fates. Peasants, soldiers, and local inhabitants captured in raids could be executed, enslaved, or abused. Knights exercised discretion selectively. Mercy was a luxury afforded only to those who could offer political or financial value. The treatment of prisoners also served as psychological warfare. Demonstrating cruelty to captives instilled fear, discouraging rebellion or resistance in the surrounding population. Knights learned that terror could be as effective as force, and many wielded it with deliberate precision. Not all violence occurred in open combat. Ambushes, night raids, and deceptive tactics were staples of knightly operations. Scouts, spies, and smaller bands of heavily armed men would strike suddenly, attacking vulnerable targets with overwhelming force. These tactics often avoided formal battles yet achieved the same goals: acquisition of wealth, elimination of rivals, and demonstration of power. In such operations, the moral and legal frameworks of the time were flexible. Knights justified ambushes as legitimate military action, or as enforcement of rights and privileges. In truth, these acts frequently straddled the line between warfare and criminality, illustrating the dual nature of knightly conduct. Knights were not only violent toward outsiders, they often engaged in internecine conflict. Personal feuds, territorial disputes, and rivalry over titles or marriages could erupt into prolonged campaigns of violence. Records show instances where knights attacked the holdings of neighboring knights in covert operations, seeking to destabilize rivals or coerce concessions. These conflicts were less visible than public battles but were often just as deadly. The consequences for local populations were severe. Villages could be caught between warring factions, subjected to repeated raids, forced labor, and taxation to support the combatants. The so-called noble warriors thus created a shadow of war that extended far beyond formal campaigns. The pervasive threat of violence shaped the medieval psyche. Peasants and townspeople lived with constant fear, knowing that the knightly sword could strike at any moment. Even when no open warfare occurred, knights maintained their authority through intimidation, displays of strength, and occasional acts of cruelty. This psychological dominance reinforced their power and ensured obedience without constant direct confrontation. For knights, war was never just a matter of duty or honor, it was an opportunity. Opportunities for ransom, looting, political leverage, and personal advancement were integral to the calculation of violence. The battlefield and the surrounding countryside became a stage where ambition, greed, and strategic cunning could play out under the guise of noble duty. The hidden violence of knights had profound consequences. Communities were destabilized, economies disrupted, and social hierarchies enforced through fear rather than justice. The public image of knights as heroes was maintained through chronicles, legends, and propaganda, while the realities of their conduct, raiding, pillaging, ambushing, and exploiting, remained largely invisible to posterity. The shadows of war reveal a crucial aspect of knighthood. Power was exercised in ways both overt and covert. The knight's swords were not merely instruments of battlefield glory, they were tools for control, wealth acquisition, and enforcement of social order, often at the expense of the very people they claimed to protect. Understanding the shadows of war allows us to see medieval knights more fully, not just as symbols of chivalric virtue, but as complex figures operating in a morally ambiguous world. Violence was not confined to the battlefield, it permeated daily life, relationships, and politics. Behind the pageantry and legend lay a reality shaped by ambition, cruelty, and strategy, a reality often hidden from public view but integral to the functioning of medieval society. Chapter 10: Legacy of the Hidden Knight. What history forgot. Medieval knights occupy a special place in our imagination. Stories of chivalry, valor, and courtly honor have been passed down for centuries, shaping our understanding of the Middle Ages. Yet as we have seen, the reality behind the polished armor and noble oaths was far more complex. Knights led dual lives, publicly upholding ideals of piety, loyalty, and courage, while privately engaging in vices, secret ambitions, and calculated violence. The discrepancy between the knightly image and actual behavior has puzzled historians for generations. Publicly, knights were celebrated as defenders of Christendom and models of virtue. Manuscripts and chronicles often highlight their battlefield heroics, tournament victories, and acts of generosity toward the poor. Privately, however, many knights were gamblers, profiteers, and manipulators. They exploited peasants, looted churches, engaged in secret alliances, and practiced psychological and physical training designed for efficient killing. Their lives were a constant balancing act, maintaining the appearance of honor while pursuing personal advantage, wealth, and survival in a turbulent world. This duality reveals much about the nature of power in the medieval period. The ideal of chivalry was as much a social tool as a moral code. Knights who mastered the art of appearances gained influence and status, while those who failed risked social exclusion or death. In many ways, the mask of honor was as vital as the sword itself. Over time, the more morally ambiguous aspects of knighthood were softened or erased from cultural memory. Legends focused on noble deeds, romanticized battles, and courtly love, while everyday realities, raids, secret violence, gambling, and exploitation, were minimized or ignored. Epic poems, romances, and paintings favored stories that reflected ideals rather than facts, creating a simplified, heroic image of the knight. This process of myth-making served multiple purposes. It reinforced social hierarchies, justified the authority of the nobility, and provided moral exemplars for the wider population. But it also obscured the hidden truths of knightly life, creating a historical narrative that emphasizes virtue while neglecting vice. Examining the hidden aspects of knighthood provides valuable lessons about power, ambition, and human behavior. Knights illustrate how authority can be exercised both openly and secretly, how personal gain can coexist with public duty, and how moral codes can function as both guides and masks. The secret lives of knights remind us that history is rarely simple. Figures celebrated as heroes may have pursued selfish or ruthless goals, while those condemned as villains might have been constrained by circumstance or survival. Understanding this complexity allows for a more nuanced interpretation of the past, one that recognizes both achievement and flaw, courage and cruelty. Modern media, from films to video games, continues to perpetuate the heroic image of knights, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and chivalric conduct. Yet scholars and historians increasingly challenge these portrayals, highlighting the practical, often ruthless strategies that underpinned knightly success. By uncovering the hidden realities, we gain insight into the human dimension of medieval warfare, politics, and society. Despite extensive research, much about the private lives of knights remains speculative. Personal diaries, letters, and court records provide glimpses, but the full scope of their daily lives, especially the moral compromises, secret training, and hidden ambitions, cannot be fully reconstructed. This enduring mystery adds to the allure of knights, inviting curiosity and scholarly inquiry alike. What history forgot. History often forgets the complexity of knights, choosing instead to remember an idealized version. But by examining their secret habits, clandestine strategies, and private vices, we gain a more complete picture. Knights were not only warriors, they were gamblers, schemers, trainers, profiteers, and manipulators. They were products of a society that demanded both public virtue and private cunning, and they navigated that society with remarkable skill. In the end, the legacy of the hidden knight challenges our assumptions about morality, honor, and power. It forces us to question the narratives we accept and to consider the dualities inherent in human behavior. The knights who have been immortalized in legends were not merely paragons of virtue. They were complex, flawed, and profoundly human. Conclusion. The story of medieval knights, when viewed through the lens of secrecy and hidden ambition, is a story of contradiction. It is a tale of public valor shadowed by private vice, of loyalty intertwined with self-interest, and of honor coexisting with brutality. Knights were not only defenders of the realm but also products of it, shaped by a world in which survival, wealth, and power often required actions concealed from history. Understanding these hidden aspects enriches our perception of the medieval era. It reminds us that beneath the armor, behind the banners, and beyond the oaths, knights were not simply heroes of legend. They were men navigating the complexities of life, ambition, and morality in a world far harsher and more unpredictable than the stories we tell.